Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SynMax Intelligence Podcast. I'm Eric Anderson, CTO of SynMax, and I'm happy to have you here today. And we're happy to have Alan Meck with us. Alan is with PG&E, and he is a power markets analyst. Is that right, Alan?
I am a principal market design analyst. Yes.
Principal market design analyst. I apologize about that. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. Everything Alan says is his own opinion, not the opinion of PG&E, and we're excited to discuss power markets today. So, Alan, why don't we just go and kick it off with a little bit of your career story? How'd you end up in your current role? And tell me about what a day in the life looks like.
Sure. So my career story is completely crazy because there's no reason I should be doing energy policy. I originally went to law school looking to be a district attorney, and then ended up getting picked up by the California Public Utilities Commission because I happened to move in next door to someone who was working there, and they recommended I drop an application in. And so my whole entire life took a very hard left turn into energy policy. And so, yeah, then from the CPUC, I went to San Diego Gas and Electric, spent 8 years there, and now got picked up at Pacific Gas and Electric. And now my focus is on CAISO. That's the California Independent System Operator. They're the grid operator who manages the buying and selling of power on the California wholesale market. And yeah, it's my job to monitor the goings-on in CAISO policy and make sure that hopefully when we go to change rules that we don't break anything or run the ship to ground by accident.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting place you ended up. You might be a little bit better off than if you were a district attorney. California, for all of our listeners who don't know, is definitely a unique grid. It is one that is kind of running the forefront of the experiment.
You can say crazy.
I wasn't going to say crazy. I didn't say that. But I would say that we both agree, no matter your perspective, right, that California is certainly a leader in the new experiment of trying to transition fully to renewables, right? Which, if you don't know much about electricity, it is supply and demand must always be equal to each other. A lot of that imbalance is, or part of that imbalance is starting to be solved with batteries, but there's a lot of challenges trying to balance the grid. So let's talk a little bit about how California is managing that transition. I believe 2030 is the date they want to be 100% renewable. And what things are currently in progress? What things remain to be done?
2045 is the date.
Okay, you got a little bit more time.
Renewable.
Yeah,
we've got a little bit more time, but that's in the energy world. That's kind of right around the corner, and certainly not helped by this massive spike in demand that we're anticipating in the future with data centers. So it's going to be a challenge. How are we doing on that? I think last I checked, data from about 2 years ago showed that we're a little bit above 50% renewables, I believe. And so we've still got a ways to go, because keep in mind it took 20 plus years to get here to where we are. It starts back in 2002 when we first decided to implement what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and started adding a little bit of clean energy slowly but surely, and got to 50% now 20-something odd years later. And so in another 20 years, we're hoping to get to 100. That's going to be challenging. It's going to require an all-hands-on-deck approach. A lot of solar, a lot of wind, and a lot of wind from different places. Wind is a funny renewable energy source, in my opinion, because the geography of it really impacts its load-carrying capability. So, like, wind located in California is not equal to wind that's located in, like, Wyoming or New Mexico. And so unfortunately, we don't have the transmission lines, at least not right now, to be able to carry all that wind from those places where the wind source is really valuable. There's talk of offshore wind as well, up in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, the topic du jour that everybody's uncle wants to ask about is always nuclear. And I, I always just shrug my shoulders at that. I don't know. Not right now is all I can say. But who knows? In the future, the political winds may change. For anyone who doesn't know, California is barred by legislation from building nuclear power plants. And I don't know. At some point, our demand for renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gases and the ability to maintain electric reliability and our desire to stop nuclear from being built, those three things are going to
They'll have to come
smash.
to some kind of a resolution. Yeah. I mean, you brought up a lot of interesting topics there. I guess I'll take it right from the top. So the first one you brought up, talking about the wind, right? When I think about any type of entity that wants to transition fully to, renewable energy, there's really two components. And one of it is the supply of it. You need to have enough energy to be able to do it 100%. But in my mind, the trickier one is the balance of it, right? Supply must always equal demand in electricity. And you either have to be very strategic in how you place these assets to make sure that you always have enough excess, to cover it under a regular profile, or you've got to take some other, storage approach, batteries being the most obvious one, but pump storage being another reliable one. Between those two things, which do you think is going to be the most difficult for CAISO to transition to 100% renewable by 2045?
Oh, good question. So I would have to say the storage end, only because the insane amount of demand that we're going to have to meet in the next 20 years is so steep that you can't worry about citing it too much. It's almost like you can't build enough, probably. Anything that does get built is probably going to end up being useful. So I think that storing it is probably going to be the bigger challenge. But let me posit another potential answer that was left off of your list of things to do with balancing, and that's by balancing your geography of load. Because if you imagine, you might have a low load day in California because it's cloudy, or it's just not hot for whatever reason, or it's fine in California, but there's this massive heat dome sitting over Utah and Colorado. And so you might have a lot of times where it's beneficial to trade power across long distances to other states. And so it's important to have, as you mentioned, a good balance of the geography of your resources, but it's equally important to have a good balance of your load to be able to trade those resources to places where it's the most beneficial at that particular minute.
Yeah, I guess, so this is kind of getting into EDAM versus Markets Plus, right? For those who don't know, there's kind of two competing approaches to this better trading environment. I mean, California already has a real-time market where they can trade real-time with neighboring states, but EDAM and Markets Plus are rival proposals to create a day-ahead market. I don't know how much we need to unpack this, but a day-ahead market is essentially you can commit resources 1 day ahead of time, right, when hopefully the forecasts are as accurate as they can be before real-time, to make sure that you have adequate resources to meet demand. So California already on the real-time market, which usually is in 15-minute increments, has this ability to trade with other states. And right now they're proposing this system called EDAM, Extended Day Ahead Market, to be able to do that kind of planning 1 day ahead. And that could be one of the big keys to them being able to transition to renewables. But not everyone, and again, we're talking about political wins. You brought that up earlier in your nuclear comment, and we'll definitely get to that. Not everyone wants what is kind of an expansion of CAISO's policy, right, in this EDAM system. And so the Southern Power Pool is proposing an alternative and trying to sell it to utilities, and that's called Markets Plus. It's essentially the same thing, but they've made it, jettisoned of what they see as the overbearing control that California would then have on neighboring grids. Any comments on that?
Several. Yeah, you describe it pretty well. To give people a slightly more nuanced flavor of picture of it, So CAISO actually already has a both day-ahead and real-time market, and currently we are running a real-time market that is regionally available, and most of the rest of the Western Interconnect is in that regional real-time market. And now what EDAM is doing is opening up also CAISO's day-ahead market to any entity that wants to join. And in parallel to that is SPP's Markets Plus, which is building a completely new day-ahead and real-time market as an alternative to California's. And so you've got sort of a competition amongst the two, trying to compete for customers to sign up for one or the other.
And what's the deciding entity in that? Is it the individual utilities sign up, or who are they marketing to, and how are they going to measure their success?
It's balancing authorities. In general, for the most part, the West is consistent of vertically integrated utilities and some federal power marketers that act as their own balancing authority. Then there are a couple of smaller like co-ops and publicly owned like citywide utilities. So just to name some of the key players, to give people an example, like NV Energy is Nevada's energy operator. Then there's PacifiCorp that's just north of California. There's PacifiCorp West, and then PacifiCorp East kind of like spans a long stretch along from California's northern border over to Utah. They're cut up every which way. And so the more entities that join one or the other, it gives each market, so what each market is looking for is three main things. One, a diversification of load, and then access to generation and the transmission system that comes with each entity that joins.
Okay. So it's almost, solving the balancing problem, right, of having more difficult to predict renewables versus traditional baseload power generation by diversifying your risk, right? It's like an insurance pool, right?
Exactly.
An excess over here is going to be transferred to a deficit over here. And so a big part of California's strategy in trying to make this transition is going to be to grow this EDAM system. And how early are we in this disagreement between the two systems? Has anybody committed to one or the other, or is it still really early on and no one's kind of picked which side they're going to be on?
So the answer to that question, unfortunately, depends on the age of the person you're asking, because the old heads in the energy space will tell you this fight goes on 70 years ago that it's been brewing. And I don't know hardly anything about the history of the fight between California and the rest of the West. So as far as I understand, it's just been different institutions that were kind of created sort of in parallel, and then they just kind of like grew apart. And it's come to a point where there's a lot of animosity, where there's California on one side and the anti-California crowd, which seems to be a significant chunk of the rest of the West, unfortunately, on the other side. The most immediate fight, though, between EDAM and Markets Plus probably started really crystallizing maybe about 5-10 years ago. CAISO had been looking to incorporate some neighboring balancing authorities into itself, and then those kind of like fizzled, and finally they came up with this half measure that we called EDAM, where instead of fully integrating, we're just going to half integrate people and just bring them into the day-ahead market. And that started up in earnest in about 2018, and then it failed for a little bit and kicked around, and then restarted in earnest in about 2020, late 2020, and went through a lot of policy development, a lot of discussions with neighbors around the West, and got a tariff approved, I want to say in 2023 we got it approved, and now we're scheduled to go live May of next year with the first, there'll be 2 participants joining, one in May and then I think one in Q3 or Q4 of next year.
Okay. So, when I think about EDAM and Markets Plus, described in abstract, they sound like they're just marketplaces, right? It is the ability for me to transact in the day ahead market and be able to secure, demand with providers, right? And does it have to be one or the other? I mean, does a balancing authority have the option to say, I'm going to look at my bids on Markets Plus and EDAM, and I'm going to bid in wherever the price is most favorable, or does it have to be an all or nothing?
So that's a great question. It does have to be an all or nothing, and there are good reasons for that, because if you could move in and out of one market at will, that gives entities, especially kind of the bigger entities, the ability to de facto withhold their resources from the places that they know really need it. And that kind of gets us into the territory of like anyone who remembers the California energy crisis of 2000. As a California energy policy expert, I definitely do. I worry about it a lot. So yeah, it is an all or nothing type thing. You need to choose one, or you can stay out of both, and you can still economically offer into California, but your choices are probably limited. Market? Well, also the day-ahead market. We accept tens of gigawatts of economic bids from our neighbors every single day here in California. As I understand it, that's kind of unique in the U.S. There aren't many other ISOs or RTOs that do that kind of economic bidding at their boundaries. But yeah, we have a lot of economic bidding.
And they're bidding day ahead, not real time?
Both.
So the mechanism already exists for this, but I guess, the impetus behind EDAM is to make it more stable, right? California, growing share of renewables, stability is something that they're seeking after in order to make this transition. And EDAM would essentially allow them to secure more resources into the common pool, whereas this, ad hoc economic bidding it's going to be much more difficult to do that. Am I characterizing that right?
Yeah, I would characterize it as lowering transaction costs, because right now it's kind of like you have to worry about what you've got. Let's say that you've got 10 megawatts that you need to serve, and you've got 15 megawatts worth of supply. So at the beginning of the day, you say, okay, now I can offer in 5 megawatts worth of extra supply into CAISO's market. And so there's a lot of inefficiencies there, whereas if you just submit all of your load into one market and all of your supply into one market, in theory, that market could optimize and find a lot of opportunities for, hey, I found a better buyer for your power over here, and hey, I found some cheaper power for your load over here, and it's just a lot cleaner.
It creates a wider liquid market, which allows for more optimization of the assets. And it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because a computer's going to optimize just way better than an operator sitting there at a switch can.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, what's the conflict then? Like, why don't people want to join EDAM, or why are they considering Markets Plus, or why does even Markets Plus exist? Is there some other regulatory baggage that comes along with participating in it?
This gets into a lot of the history that I'm not fully aware of, so I'm going to put a big
historical animosity.
Yeah, and I don't fully get it. As far as I can understand, people are just very concerned that, one, California is crazy, which I can't fault them for thinking that. We are kind of crazy. And two, California is very large. And that's scary when you have someone who's potentially thinking very differently from you and also has quite a lot of weight to throw around. That can be a scary thing to join. And so these other entities that saw a lot of value in Markets Plus, they decided, we would rather go and create our own thing and try to do something outside of California and see what they're able to make of it. So
that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are the alternatives if EDAM doesn't catch on, right? Like CAISO is hoping that it will. How else do you balance the grid? Is it batteries and pump storage, or is there another mechanism we're not thinking of besides nuclear? We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, there's batteries, pump storage. In a hypothetical world in which EDAM didn't succeed, I would expect Markets Plus to take over the entire rest of the West, and then California would just kind of be surrounded on all sides by this other market, and then we would trade across our boundaries, it might actually be better than what we've got today. I would argue that a fully unified market, with California in it, able to trade across all boundaries freely, would be the best. But I think that either one of those scenarios is probably an improvement over what we've got today, which is a very balkanized system that haphazardly allows people to economically trade into California, but not with each other. So like Nevada and Utah, for example, might have difficulty trading with one another and finding efficient transactions. So it would probably work better.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that, this whole discussion about the transition to green energy, like to most lay people like me, it's usually about the actual assets, right? Well, how are you going to get this many solar panels? And how are you going to get this many wind turbines? And where are you going to place these things? And how are you going to make sure that, you have enough storage, right? Like physical assets. When in reality, most of the story, if I'm hearing you correctly, is actually about policy. The way you achieve this is through spreading the risk, right? Taking the excesses and moving them over to the deficits and, vice versa, right? Across a larger area. And so, it creates a situation where you must not only win on the hardware front, but you also have to win on the political front to make it happen.
Yeah. Don't let me oversell you on how important my job is. It's not that important. The physical building of the assets is still far and away the more important part. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that one part of that story is getting the policy right and being able to trade those assets efficiently from one place to another to avoid having to, because everywhere where you're missing efficiencies, that means that you have to build extra in order to supplement.
Where you can't find efficiencies through policy, right? You then must deploy hardware as the secondary solution. And naturally, the hardware is going to be the more costly option, right? So at least in this phase, if you have until 2045, it makes sense that you would seek out the policy solution first, right? And then default to the more expensive option later. Okay, you touched on a lot of things in your answer to your first question. Another one of them was data center demand. So, that is a big topic, right? I've been in energy for over a decade now, and, power demand has never been that exciting of a component, right? There's efficiency improvements and there's population growth and there's, the story about a lot of the population relocating from the north to the south, right? But, at least in my short stint in this business, I've never seen this much excitement on the demand side of power, right, in such a short period of time. There are massive expectations for how many data centers are going to be built. I know that there are going to be new data centers built in California as well, right? So, nobody seems to have found the exact solution to this yet, although we all know it's going to be, we're going to have to create more generating resources. But in California's case in particularly, you're kind of handicapped, right? Or maybe from the perspective of CAISO, you would say that you're taking an elevated moral position, right? In that we are going to meet this goal, 100% renewable by 2045, and we're going to be able to satisfy this additional demand, which just a few years ago, nobody saw coming, right? So, talk to me a little bit about, first of all, do you think that the data center hype around how much of this demand is going to actually show up, right? You look at the permitting records from the EIA, and it's just a parabolic chart of what's going to come online. Is justified, or it's a little bit of a, maybe there's a boom bust in there? What's your perspective?
Oh, man. For that, I would have to point to the people in our forecasting department. Really, based on what I hear around the water cooler, I would say it's probably a little bit in the middle, unfortunately. I'm sorry to give a political answer, but...
Chopping it in half is the easy way out. It's right in the middle.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out. But it's really hard to believe the projections that we're getting. It doesn't really make sense because, like you said, if you look over the last, I think the last chart that I saw showed demand is more or less basically flat for the last 20 years that we had to meet. And then for the next 20 years, it's increasing like 50%, which is wild. by 2045. So I have to believe that some of that is real. How much of it is real? It's tough to believe that all of it's real, but probably
I don't think
most
anyone
of it.
knows. I don't think
Yeah,
anyone knows how much of it is
it's
going to be
really
real.
hard to know.
Because it's a secondary order effect, right? So you'd have to be able to forecast the first order to then get the knock-on. And the first order is data center growth is growing because the new AI technology, LLMs, is extremely power hungry, right? That seems to be infiltrating is probably the wrong word, becoming a part of every single user experience in our lives in an increasing way, which means that the real story about how many data centers, it's not just how many data centers are built, it's how many are going to be on and running constantly, right? Is going to come down to just how prolific this technology ends up being in the future. Certain companies, right, are throwing it on everything. I can't go to a Google webpage without a chatbot jumping in from the side corner wanting to help me. It's like Clippy from the 90s, if anybody remembers that. But then there's a lot of places it hasn't been applied yet, and there's probably a lot of applications for it that haven't yet been discovered. So in my mind, it is almost unpredictable to know how much of this demand is really going to show up.
Yeah, yeah. And it presents a ton of challenges, and especially in the West, because everything is so scattered. And in the West, so actually, let me pull up here.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot. You are my first guest that has ever sent slides in advance. You're welcome to share your screen. I've also got the same slides. I can share mine, whichever works better.
Yes, let me see if I can.
While you're pulling
Okay.
that up, oh, there it is. Go ahead. Okay.
So
We've got a nighttime map of all the lights of the United States.
yeah, so I was at an energy conference recently where someone gave this as an illustration, and I really liked it because it shows you just how radically different the eastern U.S. is versus the West. On the east, you can see so just for everyone's understanding, this is just a simple satellite view of the United States at nighttime. And you can see just based on the brightness in the east, all of the places, like all the major cities, and you can see how closely all the load centers are together. And then you compare that to the West, and you can see how sparsely populated it is. And if you imagine trying to get electricity, trying to trade electricity in the West, means that you have to have transmission lines that are going to be thousands of miles long to bridge these different points of load.
Yeah, big demand centers. Yeah, it
Yes.
really tells the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just about the necessity of transmission in this figure. You cannot create as efficient a system in the West as you can in the East. You need more transmission per megawatt or per utility customer, whatever metric you want to use, just because of how spread out everything is.
Yes.
And it also looks like there's a clear line. It looks like Dallas is the differentiator, where the lights kind of go dark and everything becomes more spread out. People don't want to go west of that line.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just where we as humans have chosen to build for whatever reason. I mean, for whatever reason. Obviously, it probably goes back to the California gold rush of 1849, right?
They skipped over the dark area and went right for the gold. Yeah.
Yeah. That's literally exactly what happened. And it's funny that 175 years later, we're dealing with the ramifications of that mass migration.
Yeah.
And so to round out the answer to your question, it really creates a lot of challenges because it's not just about building the resources, it's about building the transmission lines on top of that to be able to trade those resources efficiently from one place to the other, which is unfortunately also wildly expensive. So we got challenges.
I'm going to put a pin in that. I want to come back to that topic of expense because California consistently ranks one of the most expensive regions for utilities, or one of the most expensive states for electricity. And I think your map definitely speaks to one of the big reasons behind why that is. But I want to go back to nuclear, which was another thing you brought up. We talked about data center demand growth. We've talked about the kind of geopolitics that come into California's continuing green transition. as we look to fill those two things, there's a growing voice of people who are saying the answer is obvious, right? We need to build more nuclear reactors. It's clean energy, right? It satisfies that requirement, and it's stable baseload. It's not intermittent. You touched on earlier how this was a political topic, right? And that needs to come to some sort of a resolution if we're going to optimize this resource. What are the pros and cons, right? Outside of the obvious, people are against it because they think of Chernobyl, and people are for it because, it's a good compromise.
So remind me of what your exact question was. What are the other benefits and drawbacks of it that I see?
I guess let's unpack nuclear power as a political topic a little bit.
So let me start by saying I think that nuclear has been told, we have been told a story about nuclear for a long time, and depending on which side of the political aisle you're on, you've been told obviously very different stories. And I'm not sure that either one of them is necessarily very useful. So let me start by just going over my perspective on nuclear, because it's really evolved over the last couple of years. I would have said that for the last 10 years, nuclear has been oversold to a certain group of people, and it hasn't really been justifiable as a beneficial resource because it's very slow. And when you have a lot of solar and wind on your system like we do here in California, it's not terribly useful. It can't react to like, oh, a cloud just went over and now we lost solar and we need to ramp something else up.
Spin up the reactor, throw a little more.
Yeah, nuclear doesn't spin that well. And then I think that would have shifted. That story has shifted, though, with the crunch of just raw capacity that we have lacked in the West because we kind of fell behind on building. And so if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, well, I might take nuclear, just because we're hungry for any megawatts that we can get. And then once data centers came in and once AI started up, I think the justification for nuclear is quite a bit better because nuclear does kind of what data centers need, because data centers are just like a steady load going all the way across.
Which is a steady base
and
load.
that's like the use case for nuclear, it seems like. That's not to say that you need nuclear. We can do it with solar and wind and transmission and batteries, and maybe a couple of other resources and some demand response and maybe some energy efficiency here and there. But it's probably going to be more expensive if we keep ignoring nuclear, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know. I pulled in two ways on it.
I guess, yeah, you characterize it correctly, right? So, a generation facility is not valued just by the maximum number of megawatts that it can produce. It's also valued by the predictability and its rate of change. So, a gas-fired plant, which is what most of Texas runs on, it can be stable and it can change. It can ramp up, it can ramp down, relatively quickly. Nuclear is, it's great, it's cheap, right? You can make positive arguments about it to say that it is environmentally friendly. However, it doesn't have that same quality of meeting, unpredictable demand, right, due to, a loss in supply, right? It can't fill those gaps. So, what is the green solution to being able to fill those gaps? Is it just the things we talked about before, batteries?
It's batteries, solar and wind, and lots of transmission, if you want to do it without nuclear.
Is there any room in there for maybe one or two gas-fired plants, or do you think that will never politically get across the line?
I think that gas is going to have a place in the future for the foreseeable future because, it depends on where you're talking about. Are you talking just about California? If you're talking just about California, we're not going to build any more gas. But that's not to say that gas doesn't have a place. There are, for every California there's two other Montanas and Utahs out there, that are perfectly willing to build more gas plants. and that's fine, and so I would say that especially if we have a big unified market where resources are going to get traded freely, gas is going to find buyers. It just might not be in California necessarily. And so, but there are a lot of people, like I said, who are perfectly willing to buy gas and aren't so concerned about carbon emissions and just want the cheapest electrons that they can get. And they're free to make that choice.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you about capacity markets. Do you know much about that?
Not so much.
Not so much? Okay.
I can try and answer with what limited knowledge I've got, but
well, let's see what you got, right? So one big difference between ERCOT, the market that or the ISO that operates Texas versus CAISO, right? ERCOT is, and pretty much probably every other market is, ERCOT notoriously does not have a capacity market. A capacity market is essentially a periodic auction where people can bid in resources and get paid for merely existing, right? And the idea behind it is that it is a long-term stability mechanism. It's a way to ensure that you will always have the resources committed by paying for them. So you get paid simply to not retire, to exist, right? Because a simple market-based system, the idea is that there may not be enough incentive or enough ability for someone to know, a generator to know that they're going to be profitable unless you have this system that is focusing kind of on long-term capacity. And so like every other ISO, I'm pretty sure, has a capacity market except for Texas. And California has a unique capacity market because they also integrate different tiers based on how green the power is. And I'm curious if you feel like the ERCOT experiment, and I'm not going to take it personally, I have no dog in this fight, right, is destined to fail, or maybe the capacity market, to make the other argument, is simply wasteful.
I would never say the capacity market is wasteful as a Californian, because the capacity market is the thing that we built in response to our energy crisis, and in my opinion has been the driving force for how we have managed to avoid another one. So you're not going to hear me criticize California's, we call it resource adequacy, RA for short. I'm not going to criticize our RA program. I think that it's done really, really well at its job for the last 25 years. Texas, I would not say that Texas is doomed to fail. Like some people say that California is crazy, I would say that Texas is crazy, but it works for them for the most part. And it's a different way of doing things. It's truly the Wild West out in Texas, is how I would describe it. But the thing that I would say is that when you don't have a capacity market and you just so for everyone who's listening, what Texas does is that they don't require the utilities or anything to purchase a long-term contract to ensure that generators are going to be available. They just rely on generators to identify, hey, I think that I can turn a buck by participating in Texas market. And I'm thinking of data that I saw maybe like 10, 15 years ago, so forgive me, this is stale, but I remember seeing a professor's presentation that showed every generator's profits in Texas are basically like 0.0000 so there's 8,760 hours out of the year, and for like 8,755 hours, it's like 0.00, and then for like 5 hours out of the year, it's like this straight line up, and
as the real-time price spikes.
Yeah. Like 1 or 2 days or like a week or something in Texas, and everybody makes all of their money for the year on that basically. And I was just like, that is a wild lottery system. Like, what if your generator's out for those 5 hours? Like, your whole company just went under. I don't know. I assume it's not quite that dire, but
that's fascinating. I did not know that. That's very interesting.
It's a ride, I imagine, being a generator in Texas.
Yeah, as a former gritty customer, I became acutely aware of those moments when the generators were making all their money. Yeah, you brought up the early 2000s power crisis in California, and this was famously covered in the documentary Smartest Guys in the Room and has been covered in a lot of other places. But it was a period where California was liberalizing and deregulating their market, and there were a lot of bad players, and I'm afraid to say one of the biggest ones was here in Houston that took advantage of that. So, it sounds like that's kind of your area of expertise. You want to talk about what went wrong there and how you guys fixed it?
Yeah, basically we allowed for economic withholding from our market. And so when we had a heat wave, the simple explanation is if we had, let's say, 10 megawatts worth of demand and there were 12 megawatts worth of resources, well, we allowed one or two companies to own 2 or 3 megawatts worth of that total supply. And so it was very easy for them to just withhold, more capacity than California absolutely needed before it was going to experience blackouts, and we're able to drive up that price massively, artificially, just because we were experiencing some mildly hot days. And that was painful, traumatic. We just finished paying for the energy crisis December 31st of 2022, so just under 3 years ago. It was a painful lesson that we learned.
When you say you just finished paying for it, does that mean there had to be bonds issued or something
Yes.
in order to pay the immediate bills, and then they just paid off? Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it was the Department of Water Resources, DWR, that was given the green light to sign whatever contracts they possibly could in order to get back in front of the capacity crunch. And so they signed a bunch of contracts at wildly inflated rates in order to get us back in the black. And yeah, we just finished paying off all those bonds. So it's been and so when you talk to a California policy expert, when we raise some concerns about economic withholding and stuff, and I've raised some myself recently about Markets Plus, I really look at what some other people are doing, and I'm like, okay, I understand you guys don't want to listen to California, you don't like us, but seriously, when a Californian is talking to you about economic withholding, I think that this is the one topic where you need to listen, because I maybe know what I'm talking about.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? What is an economic withholding?
Sure. So the way that markets typically clear in energy is that, so let's go back to the hypothetical that I laid out where you've got 10 megawatts of demand, you've got 12 megawatts worth of total supply and a number of different suppliers, but let's say that a couple of really big suppliers own 3 megawatts, for example. It would make sense for you to withhold 2,001 megawatts from the grid because you know that that's going to put California into a shortage. And you know that even though you're withholding 2,001 megawatts, the other 999 that you're selling that you still have available is going to skyrocket from, let's say, $50 a megawatt hour to $1,000 a megawatt hour. And you're going to make out massively because you were able to artificially drive up the price. It's classic economic monopoly.
Well, cornering the market, right? So if I
Exactly.
control the complete supply of something, right, then there can be no efficient market, and I can set the price and sell it for whatever I want to. And so, this early 2000s deregulation, while well-intentioned, it wasn't trying to create this, right? People took advantage of the looseness of some of its policies, and they would hold on to power, which supply must always equal demand, right, until they got the offer that they wanted, and then sell it back at a highly inflated price.
Exactly.
And I'm sure some of the traders listening would say it was a lot more technical than that, but in abstract, right, this is what ultimately happened. And so it was a system of perverse incentives, right, at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so the way that California has come back from that is how?
With the RA program, resource adequacy. So after the energy crisis, after DWR signed a bunch of contracts at inflated prices. Then we created the RA program. And so from then on, every single year, and then also within the year, every single month, all of the load serving entities under the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission's jurisdiction, have to file what's called the RA supply plan. And at a year out, I think we have to show that we've got 90% of the resources that we're forecasted to need in order to meet our demand, plus the planning reserve margin. So it's kind of like if you have 10 megawatts worth of demand and you have a planning reserve margin of, let's say, like 20%, that means that you need to carry 12 megawatts instead of 10, just in case something happens that you weren't anticipating. And so we have to demonstrate 90% supply at a year out, and then every single month, 45 days prior to the run of the month, we have to show, hey, look, we've got 100% of everything that we need plus the PRM in order to be able to remain solvent. And so by forcing all of the load-serving entities to work in concert and make sure that we're all forward contracting for the capacity that we're going to need, we ensure that California always has being offered into its market enough supply in order to meet demand.
Yeah, it removes the ability of a single actor to control a piece of the market because everything must be committed in advance, right? So any type of problem like this would be spotted a long time before it, actually comes to fruition. Okay, well, we are coming up on time here. That's 45 minutes. Alan, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about energy markets. I think we got a lot of great content in there. And thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you. I hope it does well.